Ki ngā maunga, ki ngā awa, ki ngā waka, ki ngā tātai tangata, nā e te reo o mihi ki a koutou, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou kua hui mai nei ki tēnei whare, ki te kōrero, ki te whakarongo, ki ngā kaupapa o tō tātou hui. Nau mai, tauti mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Sara Templeton tako ingoa no Ingarani oku tipuna, kei te noho o ki Ōtautahi. So welcome to this Christchurch Conversations on the future of public transport in Ōtautahi Christchurch, brought to you by the fabulous team at Te Pūtahi and supported by the Council through the Sustainability Fund. These Christchurch Conversations are important for residents to engage with urban issues and to discuss the future of our city outside of formal local government-led consultation. So I'm Sara Templeton, and in my 7th year as a Christchurch City Councillor. This term, I'm the Portfolio Lead for Climate Change. I also sit on the Greater Christchurch Partnership, where the Christchurch City Council partners with ECan, with Selwyn, with Waimakariri, Waka Kotahi, Ngāi Tahu and others to look at the issues that concern us all. As you will hear tonight, public transport has many more benefits than emissions reduction, but with 54% of our city's emissions coming from transport, mode shift from single occupancy fossil fuelled vehicles to more sustainable modes such as bus, bike, walking and mass rapid transit is crucial if we are to meet our goal of being net carbon neutral by 2045. And that's a city goal signed off by the Christchurch City Council in 2019 after a citywide consultation and is 5 years ahead of the government's targets. Now, a few stats. So according to the 2018 census, a little out of date now, approximately half of the commuter trips taken by private vehicle in Christchurch are less than 7k. Only 4% of residents took the bus to work, which is significantly lower than similar-sized cities in New Zealand and internationally. In Christchurch, 6% of commuters cycle to work and 4% walk, and in 2018, 17% of total daily trips in Christchurch were made by using the bus, cycling or walking. 96% of non-Christchurch residents working in Christchurch drive or are driven to work. It's fair to say that there's room for improvement, and with Christchurch's population projected to grow to 600,000 by 2048, we simply cannot afford to delay putting in place a fit-for-purpose transport system. While Christchurch do not currently have signed-off goals for public transport, that's coming, there are several key projects underway. We are setting VKT, that's vehicle kilometres travelled, reduction targets for the Greater Christchurch with our neighbours and with Waka Kotahi. We have an enhanced bus network plan called PT Futures, signed off by partner councils, and you're going to be hearing about that shortly. 4 of us got together and did a notices of motion to our councils last term, and we lobbied central government. So a nod here to Mike Davidson, who's in the room, to Vicky Southwith, who is there as well, so 2 of them, and Lan Farm, who is online watching. And the 4 of us put notices of motions up, which led to councils lobbying government, and we managed to get $78 million to bring forward the hard infrastructure pieces that were needed to accelerate public transport futures. And that will include, amongst other things, 22 kilometres of new bus lanes to help making our system more reliable and attractive, and at least 400 new bus shelters so that we're not waiting in the rain. We also have a draft strategic transport plan due to be consulted on later this year, was due last term, and this is where you are so important. Please get involved. It makes a difference. Read the plan, discuss it, and submit on it. Help us refine it and make it the best plan it can be for Ōtautahi. Come along to council and speak directly to the hearings panel and make sure that councillors hear how important it is to you and why, as we prepare to be a 21st century sustainable city and not a relic of the nostalgic fossil-fuelled past. Mandate is important and advocacy matters, and after the transport plan is approved, fingers crossed, next will be the funding. And so submitting on the long-term plan, Council's 10-year budget, will also make a difference. It will be out in March next year, and I'll be putting information and links to both of these consultations up on my Facebook page, and they'll be on the Council website as well. You can also get in contact with your councillors and community board members, email, engage on social media, and have a chat in person wherever you can to your elected members and let them know what matters most to you. So the time is now, to shift how we think and how we travel, for us and for our children after us. Mō tātou a, mō ka uri, a muri aki nei. So enjoy the rest of the evening, and over to you, Jess.
Thank you, Sara. Tēnā koutou. Ki te mana whenua o tēnei takiwā nai tua huriri, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Ko Jessica Halliday, tōka wingua ko Ōtautahi Whakahaere o te Pūtahi, Centre for Architecture and City Making. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessica Halliday, the Director of Te Pūtahi, and it's my pleasure to briefly outline proceedings for tonight's Christchurch Conversation, Driving Change, Public Transport Futures. Thank you all for joining us online and here in person. It's lovely to see the room so full. For those of you who are new to this series into Te Pūtahi, we're an independent third sector, aka non-profit, organisation who've been working here in Ōtautahi for over 10 years, seeking to make it easy, desirable and fun for more people to get involved in the shaping and enjoyment of Ōtautahi Christchurch. Ultimately, we want our region, I suspect like you, to have healthier and more equitable urban and living systems. Christchurch Conversations, He Whakawhiti Kōrero, began 9 years ago in 2014. It is a program of free events that invites local, national and international speakers and leaders to inspire and challenge us on our city's future. Tonight is the second of 4 conversations this year. I'd like to thank those who have made tonight's, there we go, there they are, those who have made tonight's event possible. He Whakawhiti Kōrero Christchurch Conversations is funded through the Christchurch City Council's Sustainability Fund and supported by He Puna Ora Regenerative Action Lab at AUT. So to briefly outline the shape of this evening, we'll hear from 4 different speakers, and then 3 of them will form a panel for a Q&A session facilitated by my colleague M Grace-Stent. And this is when you'll be able to ask questions as well. And then we close, as we usually do, with poetry. Whether you're attending this event online or you're in the room, you can ask the panel questions by texting your question to this number, 020 411 09415. So you can either record the number now, but it will also be on the screen during the Q&A. In our online audience on YouTube, you have the option to ask questions via the chat function on YouTube as well. And questions from both sources will be conveyed to the panel by the Te Pūtahi team. Apologies in advance, there's every chance we won't be able to put all your questions to the panel, and if there aren't too many unanswered, we'll ask the panel to provide written answers we can post on social media after the event. So, to paraphrase Jane Austen, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a city that desires to avoid traffic congestion, as well as reduce carbon emissions, must be in want of a robust public transport system. In recent years, local, regional and central governments have been dedicated to working out what this would mean for us here in Ōtautahi and Greater Christchurch. And tonight we'll hear about this future planning for public transport from Jessie Burgess, Senior Strategy Manager at Environment Canterbury. We'll also hear from Rosee Hodgson, a PhD student at the University of Otago, who will tell us that public transport isn't just about reducing emissions and congestion, it improves social and economic equity and shapes citizenship. Sometimes we have a tendency to think that it isn't possible for us to transform our transportation systems, that we're different to other places, that we face unique challenges in our car dependency, and that it's special to us. Well, tonight, urban designer George Weeks is here to dispel this and other myths and share the art of the possible with us. But first, it is my pleasure to welcome our first speaker to the stage, Natalie O'Connell, is an assistant planner who graduated in 2022 from the University of Canterbury. She's a youth advocate for an equitable and accessible transport system, and she's going to discuss her experience growing up in Ōtautahi on the bus, the importance of public transport for youth, and the potential of a public transport system for future generations. Please welcome Natalie.
Kia ora koutou toko ingoa. Ko Natalie toko ingoa. Growing up in Ōtautahi, public transport has been a part of my life since I was at primary school. I started using it on my own at age 8 to get to school, and I continued to use it when I started high school. I'd bus to school with my friends and stop at Riccarton Mall each morning to get a bag of chips at Pack and Save at 8 a.m. It was fine, and I didn't think about it much, because everyone else was doing it too. It was, dare I say it, kind of fun. We all started turning 16 and things changed. Suddenly, the necessary and only way to get around at our age, that we had grown so used to, became disposable, redundant, but most of all, embarrassing. So everyone got their licence and became adults. I got my licence too, as I came to understand that a car means freedom. For the bus was merely a stepping stone to adulthood. See, the thing is, we tend to grow up with it, but we grow out of it. For a lot of young people, public transport is a part of our lives for at least a few years. Although it was the necessary way of getting from A to B, it gave us the independence to move freely without our adults, our parents, exposure and interaction to different people and situations in everyday life. These are beautiful things that are fundamental to our well-being as social creatures. I never ended up buying a car. It turns out that they're really expensive, inefficient, and bad for the environment. But it also turns out that having a licence in Christchurch is very convenient and almost painful without one. So how do we get more people on the bus and caring about public transport? We all know that increasing public transport patronage is done by creating an interconnected network that is frequent, accessible, and affordable. For Christchurch, however, we are still at a point where we have to work around a timetable rather than turn up and go. Only about 4% of people in Christchurch use the bus as their main mode of transport. And that's compared to around 80% or more by car. And these numbers do not show up out of nowhere. They're a direct result of decades of underinvestment in public transport and a series of political decisions that have allowed the car to dominate. On the flip side, we see cycling numbers in Christchurch increasing, 30% over the past 7 years, and this is because of funding and dedicated infrastructure. People don't take busing seriously because there has not been serious investment in it. Now, the culture of busing should not be understated. We have a collective view that it is only lower socioeconomic people who use the bus and who would ever want to be thought of as poor. Our car culture has solidified itself as a response to our urban form. We've got ourselves into a bit of a chicken and egg situation between changing our culture and our infrastructure. We have built an environment where cars are the most convenient way to get around, and understandably, people are now quite attached to them. But DIY is not in our DNA, and neither are cars. Aspects of Kiwi culture we have come to identify ourselves with are not intrinsic to us. Just in the same way, a clever marketing campaign cemented our DIY culture. Imagine what positive public transport messaging could do to shift our perceptions and the way we get around. And I'm not just referring to a billboard that says buses are cool, but that would be kind of fun. I'm talking about the conversations that we all have with our friends, family, and colleagues that change the world around us. So before looking towards the future of what Christchurch public transport could be, let's take a look at our past. Trams. The Christchurch tram used to be public transport from 1905 to 1954 when the network closed. It reopened as a tourist attraction loop in 1995, and it currently costs $35 to use. Who here has actually been on the tram? Okay, slay. Love that. Well, it's kind of fun, right? And we love a good tram. But does anyone else find it strange that we have a tram as a tourist attraction rather than functional public transport? Why can't we have both? And I'm not necessarily saying we should now devote all our resources to making the tram public transport, but I'm merely highlighting the fact that it wasn't radical to have an efficient tram network in the 1930s. In fact, it was part of our city's identity. So why should it be radical and idealistic 100 years later in 2023? Whether it's trams, trains, or buses, I'd prefer all three. We need to make meaningful change, and we need it now. As a youth born into this age, I quite literally see the effects of climate change in real time, and I know I will be alive to see it worsen. Alas, we sit here today to discuss that our system needs fundamentally improving. But what can we do today to change the world around us? Because the reality is that the public transport system we have today will be the same tomorrow. What we can change is the culture. After all, we are the culture. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. My name is George Weeks, and I'm going to talk about the art of the possible. In other words, how we can use our transport system to make our lives better. Now, a bit of context. I'm European. I grew up in Bristol, a city famous for Concorde and the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and I worked for many years as an urban designer at Transport for London. That isn't me. And then I moved to the Auckland Design Office 6 years ago to refresh the Auckland City Centre Master Plan and to go sailing at the weekends. And I still live in Auckland, but I do actually enjoy travelling south of the Bombay Hills, and it's a real treat to be here in Christchurch. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, why the hell is an Aucklander from Europe here talking about urban transport in Christchurch? Christchurch's history is completely unique. And we're different. Our urban planning history is different. And I agree. So let's go somewhere else. Let's fly far, far away to a different continent. I want to take us away to a big country that many of us have visited on holiday, who have flown through. I'm talking about the country that practically invented the car and which makes millions of cars every year. A country where every city had tramways up until the 1930s and removed them all in the 50s and instead to build urban motorways, ripping through the urban fabric and making space for public housing projects on the edge of the cities. And all of this while building one of the most monumental expressway networks in the world. I'm talking about a country that loves to build monuments. Its most famous monument is the Statue of Liberty. So by now you've probably realized I'm talking about my favorite country, France. And while our image of urban France is of elegance and beauty, much of France actually looks more like this. This could be the Auckland Central Motorway Junction, but it's the Bungalow interchange in Paris. And you can see this scene in almost any country in Europe, like Spain, for instance. This is Bilbao, pretty ugly scene, isn't it? Even though most of the images that us have of Bilbao, if we have one, is the stunning Guggenheim Museum, even though for everyday life the Bilbao Metro is much, much more useful. Now, my beef is that it's inaccurate to claim that livable cities are somehow inevitably European or in European DNA, but it's really amazing the rubbish that people will spout about Europe. For example, let's go to Europe and learn about some European myths. I mean, first things first, it's far too complicated to think of it as 44 separate states. So let's just have the myth that Europe's one big homogeneous country, the Republic of Europe, much simpler. And in this Republic of Europe, every city is thousands and thousands of years old. And in return, I raise you Milton Keynes in England, which itself is fascinating, but it's not very old. And in the Republic of Europe, apparently car parking isn't an issue. Now, this claim at the top is an astonishing claim. Maybe it's based upon early 20th century Impressionism, because while Paris is a historic city, it looks like this. Paris is a modern city with modern city problems. And if you try and remove car parking in Paris, you get this. And in the Republic of Europe, everyone always cycles for everything because it's in their European DNA. But really there's huge variation. British people cycle about as much as Canadians. The French are slightly keener. The Dutch cycle the most. The Belgians are just next door to the Netherlands, but Belgians cycle much less, even though their geography is almost identical. Similarly, in the Republic of Europe, every car is tiny because all cities are old and all European countries are always anti-car. But that's rubbish. If you want to buy a luxury car that isn't a Tesla or a Lexus, chances are it's German. And the received wisdom that Europeans don't buy utes, well, that's rubbish too. This is definitely a Ford Raptor, and this is definitely taken in Prague. And statements like this are really unhelpful and untrue because they imply that utes are in Kiwi DNA, and there's nothing we can do about it, and that's rubbish. So my overall point is that while the Republic of Europe is homogeneous, historic, and quaint, this isn't accurate. Cities in other parts of the world have just the same problems that we do. So let's stop talking about Europe as if it's one big, very quaint republic. It really, really isn't. For a start, there are 44 countries in Europe, including 12 monarchies. Each one has its own history, traditions, and folklore, and there's huge regional variation within, like the varieties of French cheese. And some countries have very high population densities. New Zealand's at the lower end of comparables. We're slightly denser than Finland, a bit less dense than Sweden. Similarly, some European countries are very, very urban. New Zealand is more urbanised than Finland. It's about the same as Sweden. And financially, New Zealanders, we're about as rich as Brits. We're about the same as the Swedes. We're poorer than the Swiss, but who isn't? And we're richer than the Greeks. So let's just collate this information for a second. So our population density is low, like Russia and much of Northern Europe. And we're an urbanised country. We've got much more in common with Norway, Sweden and Finland than we do with Russia and the Baltics. And we're a well-off country. Goodness me, what happened to my slides? There, that's better. Yeah, we're a well-off country, but we're not as rich as Norway. We're more in Sweden and Finland's camp, particularly Finland. It's our nearest twin in Europe, really. But you might say, well, very nice, but how does this geography lesson have anything whatsoever to do with transport planning in Christchurch? Well, two reasons. Firstly, countries in Europe vary hugely from one to the next, so let's not talk about a European population density because there's no such thing. And secondly, New Zealand has lots in common with many countries in Europe in terms of economics and population. Well, what of it? Well, New Zealand's land use transport system gives us about the only country in the OECD where road deaths are increasing, gives us a rotten productivity rate, one of the highest obesity rates in the world. In 2021, the Helen Clark Foundation said transport policy and investment will need to focus on basically making life better for people who are disadvantaged and reducing dependence on cars. And the rest of this presentation is going to focus unashamedly on public transport and active travel. Firstly, because we need to, and secondly, because these are the human-centred modes. I love this phraseology here about being sweet to the pedestrian and cyclist, because who wouldn't want a city with these characteristics? Imagine the opposite, a dull, ugly, dangerous city that's bad for your health. Who wants that? Like, imagine like this city here. Can anyone guess where this may be? It's Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And like many countries, the Netherlands went car mad for cars in the 60s, and Dutch streets were clogged with traffic. So what did the Dutch do? Well, they built urban motorway systems, obviously. This here is a typical Amsterdam neighbourhood, and the 60s plan was for it to look like this. So this is the vision that planners had. They didn't build this particular example, but they did convert the main canal of Utrecht into a depressed expressway, carving a huge gash through the city. Now, as part of a plan to revitalise its city centre, Utrecht decided to give the space back to the city, and it now looks like this. And it will be even better as the trees grow, and it's a really gorgeous part of Utrecht. And this is relevant to New Zealand because we're doing the same sort of thing ourselves. Look at the old State Highway 1 in Taupo on the lakefront. It's the same principle of making space for people. And good transport planning makes sense in any country, such as using rail in a country with long distances through pine forests to transport goods. Going back to Finland for a second, or New Zealand, you don't need a high overall population density to make rail viable. But there's only 5 million Finns, same as us, but unlike us, the Finns actually managed to have a passenger rail network, shown by the thick lines, throughout most of the country, between cities and within them. Population density does not preclude having passenger rail. And with a highly urbanised population, like Finland or New Zealand, you can concentrate your high-capacity public transport to support your biggest cities as they grow. This is a map of the main public transport in the Helsinki region, where you have a metro. You've got, regional trains and a metro, and you've got orbital buses, and this is being replaced as a light rail to double its capacity. And Helsinki city centre is in this red square. And in the 1960s, the plan for Helsinki city centre was to build a motorway system like this. Now, this was never built, and the 10 tram lines in Helsinki were retained and enhanced. And the new lines are often very green, like this. And in the city centre streets, it's a very space-efficient transport system. It's rapid, clean, quiet, safe. It works all year round. And if passenger rail can work in the harsh Finnish winter, I think we can cope in Canterbury. Now, Scandinavia is looking jolly cold, so let's see what's possible in a milder climate. Let's go back to France. I do like France. And in France in the 60s, they really embraced modernity with the post-war economic miracle. So cars and jets and highways were in, and urban tramways, unlike Finland, were out. By 1980, only 3 French cities still had tramways. And these are Lille, Saint-Étienne, and Marseille. But in the 1980s, there was a French Revolution, and Nantes and then Grenoble built modern tramway lines. And these were very successful, so more lines appeared in the 90s in Paris, Strasbourg, and Rouen. And this revolution exploded in the 2000s, where there were tramways built in Montpellier, Orléans, Nice, Nancy, Bordeaux, haven't quite got to Nice yet, that's 2007, Clermont-Ferrand, Mulhouse, Valenciennes, Le Mans, Marseille, Nice, got there. And then this continued into the 2010s. More tramways in Toulouse, Angers, Reims, Brest, Dijon, Le Havre, Tours, Besançon, Avignon, Caen. Another tramways opening in Annecy later this year. 7 other French cities are planning, building, or extending tramways. And the French have really worked out the template. It's priority and dedicated space for your rapid transit, attractive modern vehicles, and improvements to the surrounding cityscape. I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, that's very clever, but how do they pay for it? Well, big French cities have something awesome called a versement transport, and this is a payroll tax of about 1% that pays for public transport. And it's a very efficient system because it's clear where the transport money is coming from, which means that the transport planners can focus on transport planning. And it's good value. This is a transport map of Marseille, 3rd biggest city in France. It's built metro lines and tramways so anyone can get to the city centre in 30 minutes. And the productivity and agglomeration benefits far exceed the costs of building a system like this. And you get a public transport system that benefits everyone. But it's not just about agglomeration and productivity. Let's go to Bordeaux, and let's have a look at the Bordeaux tramway map. 4 lines, all the same colours of red wine. And this is a system that was built by a conservative mayor seeking to boost Bordeaux's economy by making the city as attractive and accessible as possible, which meant tramways to move people across the city, plus streetscape improvements and a rising bollard system to preserve streets for people by only allowing essential vehicles. And the Bordeaux trams are great because they're part of the civic space. I mean, changing trams or catching one, it's as easy as crossing the street in a beautiful tree-lined square. It's an absolute pleasure to use. Similarly, in Paris, this used to be a 6-lane highway. Now it's tramway T3, and it moves many more people. And this was done by reassigning existing road space. Here's how it looks now. Here's how it looked in 2008. This is a very, very rapid rate of delivery, changing from prioritising your traffic level of service to prioritising life. And this approach also stimulates new developments. And by reassigning space away from general traffic, there's more space for people, like my friend's 4-year-old son, who was able to cycle with me and my friend from the Gare Montparnasse to the Eiffel Tower. Très bon. One more French tramway system, and that's the city of Brest in Brittany. It's a naval port, but it's not a very big city. It's about as big as Tauranga. But Brest, unlike Tauranga, has a tram line system that carries more than 12 million passengers per year. and it's rejuvenated parts of Brest town centre that, quite frankly, needed it. And again, with light rail plus public realm improvements, it's easier to get to and nicer when you're there. And there's little bollards to preserve the pedestrian space, and there's more space for everything else that we like. Now, a point I really want to make is that space for people is very, very easy to do because as a species, we're actually quite space efficient. Now, to illustrate this, imagine a person on this graph taking up 1 unit of space. And this is true whether they walked to this destination or took public transport. Or if they cycled, it takes up a bit more space for moving and parking, but it allows people to travel further. Christchurch, you're doing very well. I line scooted up Rolleston Avenue this evening, and it was very, very busy. Hooray. But as soon as you start bringing cars into it, you need a lot more space for movement and parking. And as soon as you start providing dedicated car parking, the space requirements get bananas, 90 times as much space. In other words, the space needed for one person to drive and park in a workplace parking space is the same as 90 people if they come by public transport. And to show what this means for urban development, here's Merivale in Christchurch, which was developed around tram lines and which is walkable. And here's Hornby, which was developed around cars, and which is awful. And the transport system shapes our cities, and it shapes our streets, and it shapes us. And car companies spend lots and lots of money telling you that driving is freedom. But this is only true if nobody else is driving. Just try going to Burning Man in Nevada, the freedom to be stuck in the desert or stuck in the mud this year. Either way, you cannot beat the geometry of passenger transport. And real freedom comes when cities are welcoming to everyone, as we see here in Montreal. The best outcomes occur with a synthesis between great public transport and great public realm. And for a good example of this, let's go to Sydney, where George Street in central Sydney used to look like this, and now it looks like this, a complete curb-to-curb transformation, world-class public transport, bringing more people into the heart of Sydney. It's one of the finest boulevards in the world, and while the process of changing a busy city centre street from this to this was really very difficult, we've seen millions of passengers and billions of dollars of real estate development stimulated by this transformation, even if there's skepticism along the way. And fundamentally, a place that's easy to get to and nicer when you're there is attractive. And I want to talk about skepticism in my final example. And I want to start by illustrating an example of a nice Dutch street. And this is a Dutch street that prioritizes people. It's got brick paving, it's got cargo bikes, families on bikes, trees, benches, what's not to like. The funny thing is, it's not actually Dutch. This is London. This is a Waltham Forest mini Holland street. Now, Mini Holland is a programme led by the Mayor of London, which invested £80 million in 3 London boroughs, very intense investment to see if Dutch street design would lead to Dutch travel behaviour. And this basically consisted of filtered permeability in residential streets and protected cycleways on main roads. Here's a neighbourhood street in 2015, and here's how it looks now. It's a great space for shoppers, for cafe goers, for pub goers, for the bloke with the dog, for the people doing the filming. For the first time ever, all the retail units in this street are occupied. Nearby, the local square used to look like this. I mean, trees, traffic calming, quite nice. But now the square's twice as big, 0 cars, new trees, and it's a really delightful public space. At the railway stations in Waltham Forest, there's integrated cycle parking, and all of this incentivising has had a significant effect. People are cycling more, they're walking much more. This is unique within the UK, at least pre-COVID. Basically, rocket science, if it's easier to cycle and walk more, people will cycle and walk more. But please, please, please do not think this was an easy change. There was an infinite amount of scepticism. It was very difficult. When the first phase that I showed you earlier opened, protesters brought a coffin to the opening ceremony to proclaim the death of the high streets. They said, Mini Holland won't work. We're not Holland, we're London, we're different. After the success of Mini Holland, other areas in London proposed similar schemes. And they said, but we're not Waltham Forest, we're Hackney, we're different. And then other cities in London said, how about we try it? And people would say, we're not London, we're different. And then even within Waltham Forest, this street here with a dashed line is Mark House Road, a main north-south road in this suburb. and the streets on the left side of Markhouse Road received Mini Holland treatment filled with permeability cycleways. And then on the right, when a similar scheme was proposed, they said, we're from the other side of Markhouse Road. We're 200 metres away. We're different. Exceptionalism is infinitely fine-grained. And look, change is never easy. It's human nature to be sceptical of change, and it's a bit of a survival mechanism. But I'm talking about our human environment. Professionally speaking, as an urban designer, we can shape the human environment however we like. So really, let's step out of our jail and really think about the city that Christchurch could really be. And we owe it to ourselves to create a livable Christchurch, one that is accessible to everyone and which can really flourish and grow. So I really want to not fixate on the obstacles, but rather fixate on this quote from Thomas Barser. Don't say it cannot be done, rather say you don't know how to do it yet. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jesse Burgess, tōku ingoa. I'm here to speak to you today about the spatial plan for Greater Christchurch, the work that we've been working on for the past couple of years, and the future of public transport in the sub-region. Georgia's a bit of a tough act to follow, so hopefully I can bring this from the worldly European experience down to the Greater Christchurch level. So just get this. There we go. So the future of public transport in Greater Christchurch, the spatial strategy for Greater Christchurch. So over the past couple of years, local government, mana whenua and central government have been working together to address the strategic challenges and opportunities for Greater Christchurch through the Greater Christchurch Partnership. This has been underway since 2007, which when we originally developed the urban development strategy for Greater Christchurch. And then post-earthquake, we had the land use recovery plan, and in 2018, we had the Our Space document, the future development strategy for Christchurch, Greater Christchurch. We're now developing the spatial plan for Greater Christchurch and with consideration of mass rapid transit. This map here on the screen outlines our proposal for how growth will be accommodated up to 1 million people. By focusing growth in urban centres connected by an effective and accessible public transport network, we can accommodate population increases and achieve the outcomes we want, being quality of life, economic prosperity, affordable housing, protecting our environment, and adapting to climate change and natural hazards. Earlier this year, we undertook the Hui Hui Mai public engagement process. We had over 7,000 people complete the online survey and over 17,500 views of the Hero and Turn Up and Go videos online. We targeted youth with the workshops through 18 school and youth groups and a youth summit, and held a number of workshops drop-in sessions to hear from our community. So quite significant engagement, which was fantastic to see. So from the feedback that we had, we've developed the spatial plan, and on the screen here is the key opportunities and strategic directions, and unfortunately on the screen is not the key moves, but I'll read those out in just a second. Appreciate this is a little bit hard to see, so certainly urge anybody who's interested to jump on to the Greater Christchurch Partnership website and have a look at the spatial strategy draft as it stands at the moment. Two of the key strategic directions are focusing growth through targeted intensification in our urban and town centres and along our public transport corridors, and enabling the prosperous development of Kainganahonga on Māori land and within urban areas. The 5 key moves, as I said, that aren't shown on the slide include prosperous development of Kainganahonga, a strengthened network of centres, a mass rapid transit system, a collective focus on unlocking the potential of our priority areas. Now this includes the priority areas arising from our Tītariti partnership, priority areas arising from our technical evaluation, which include the priority development areas being Rangiora Town Centre and surrounds, the MRT corridor through from Papanui through the central city and out to Riccarton, Hornby and the Rolleston Town Centre and surrounds, and it also includes priority area of the Eastern Christchurch area. Key Move 5 is an enhanced and expanded blue-green network across Greater Christchurch. In terms of transport, the spatial plan identifies that a transformational shift in how people travel is needed to achieve major reductions in transport emissions. This is one of the biggest challenges facing Greater Christchurch and will require substantial improvements in our transport system. The spatial plan takes an integrated approach to strategic land use and transport planning to provide a pathway to achieving a more sustainable, accessible and equitable transport future. A key component of the focus on targeted intensification is the creation of an urban form that supports and encourages as many trips as possible being made by active travel, and reducing the reliance on cars means encouraging people to use public transport more often, requires significant improvements to public transport services to ensure they offer an attractive alternative to cars. As the main freight and logistics hub for Tiwai Pounamu, South Island, it is essential that the development continues to support a well-functioning freight network. I mentioned before the Key Move 3, which is a mass rapid transit system, and this particularly relates to Opportunity 6 around sustainable public transport. A strengthened urban and town centres network in Greater Christchurch will need to have strong connections between centres. This will require more realistic and viable alternatives to private car use. MRT, as it's commonly known, is a city-shaping initiative that is fundamental to the shift in urban form required to help achieve a net zero emissions future. The preferred way forward is an arterial street-running MRT system within Christchurch and enhanced express and direct buses to Selwyn and Waimakariri districts. The route chosen provides several benefits. A significant proportion of growth over the next 30 years will be focused along these corridors. It encourages investment in higher density developments and mixed use areas. It provides improved accessibility to key employment areas. Mass rapid transit systems provide reliability. So MRT vehicles are separated from cars and given priority at intersections, which allows for public transport to be consistently on time. It provides speed, so MRT travel times are similar, if not faster, than travelling by car. It provides frequency, so by operating more regularly, mass rapid transit reduces wait times to about 5 minutes or less on average. And it provides capacity, so vehicles are at high capacity and able to move lots of people. Just going to quickly touch on public transport, what's happening and what's happening at the moment and where to from here. So with COVID, we obviously had a dip in patronage. We were all locked down, we were working from home. But since then, we've seen a steady increase of patronage on our public transport network. And I think as of June, we were actually at 100% of pre-COVID patronage levels, which is fantastic and a good credit to the public transport teams across the councils in Ōtautahi. We had a challenge with the number of drivers and there were missed trips. That was pretty well publicly known. At the peak, I think we were about 50 to 60 drivers short. We now have a full complement of drivers, which is fantastic. Missed trips, we're down to 0, which is fantastic. So that's great to see, and it's starting to see an uplift in our patronage usage. We've introduced flat fares as a trial. So recently these changes came through in July, and this picked up on some of the government concessions previously, and we've capped the number of trips as well in a week, so from 10 down to 8. And hopefully all of you who are in the room using public transport have enjoyed the reduced fares, which is great to see and are very much competitive with the private vehicle and parking in the city. So our Metro Users Survey results from 2023, you can start to see some of the results coming through there, but one we're most proud of is the overall satisfaction with our public transport service being at 96%. So I want to quickly talk about some improvement initiatives that we're also undertaking. So National Ticketing Solutions. So this is a collaboration between Ōtautahi, the 13 public transport authorities across the country and the 4 suppliers. Introduces contactless payments, so you'll be able to pay with your credit card, you'll be able to pay with your phone, you'll be able to pay with your Apple Watch, all those type of things. So fantastic opportunity. We're first. Environment Canterbury is the first one off the rank, working with Ōtautahi at the moment to develop that system. There we go. So some of the project objectives there. So standardised experience across all modes across New Zealand, reduces barriers, supports regional and national objectives for mode shift, enables access to next generation payment technologies nationally at an affordable investment threshold, and supports wider government policy initiatives such as Community Connect, Super Gold, and some of the other models out there as well. We're not the first. There's plenty of other countries that are doing this already, and there's plenty of other countries that are already in the development space as well, and many that have already are in the planning and procurement phase, which is where we're at the moment as well. So by around August, I believe, next year, we should have the national ticketing solution in place. Greater Wellington will follow early in 2025, Auckland Transport in 2025 as well, and the rest of the network operators in 2026. So it's great to see this. Our system's currently out of date and end of life, so needs to be replaced. So this is an opportune time. I want to talk about PT Futures as well, which was mentioned before, and I think Sara touched on this in the introduction as well. So this is a program of improvements to increase public transport use to and from high growth, high population areas and key activity locations across Greater Christchurch, and removes the barriers to increase PT usage. The indicative business case was approved by the Greater Christchurch partners in 2020. The short-term program delivers improvements to the core routes, so this is what we call the foundation routes. It's the routes 1, 3, 5, 7 and the orbiter. This provides the foundation for MRT and aligns with infrastructure improvements, and Christchurch City recently received the Minister's $78 million for infrastructure, which is a great injection of funding into Greater Christchurch. Through the Council's collective long-term plans, the program was retimed due to funding constraints. So we saw in 2020, we were in the middle of COVID, being fiscally responsible, we moved some of the program, or our elected officials moved some of the program and our LTPs out towards the back end. There's now calls to see that potentially come the other way, the pendulum swing the other way, so that we can do more faster, and that's the challenge we have now to try and bring the operational and the infrastructure development together and deliver it faster. PT Futures sees circa $100 million invested in more infrastructure for PT. The Crown has provided the $78 million, as I said, to accelerate the delivery of the support bus priority infrastructure and bus stop improvements over the next 6 years. This will also see the operating costs increase by an estimated $70 to $100 million annually, depending on inflation. So we've got increased costs at the moment with inflation. It's a challenge across all of our work. These costs exclude mass rapid transit, which is a separate business case process. But we will see a turn up and go system on the inner core routes, which is the recommended program for the next 3 years of the LTPs. So the mass rapid transit business case, so I'm just going to quickly touch on the most viable route, what's the estimated cost, the benefits, and what a delivery timeline might look like. So what are the benefits? So more homes located along the corridor, 75% more homes, 81% more jobs, 40% of trips from Greater Christchurch to the central city via public transport in 2051, 19,200 additional households able to access the city in less than 30 minutes via public transport, and a significant saving of carbon emissions. So patronage is expected to increase by 5.7 million trips per year between 2021 and 2051. And this all builds on the PT Futures investment that we need to make as well. So the preferred way forward for Greater Christchurch in terms of mass rapid transit. So the indicative business case that Waka Kotahi undertook with the partners demonstrates that the best returns will come from a 22-kilometre rapid transit city corridor connected to the Waimaka area and Selwyn districts by coordinating high-frequency bus services. Rapid transit systems in major urban areas around the world play an important role within the transport system and overall urban structure. There are a range of factors that set these systems apart from existing forms of public transport, including user perceptions and experience in the built environment surrounding stations and stops and along corridors, and George touched on a lot of that in his presentation as well. The indicative business case provides for end-of-line facilities to maximise synergies with PT Future's funded bus services and facilities improvements in the districts. Bus priority with direct connections to the city centre and the MRT corridor extents out at Hornby and Belfast. Real-time information signage and mobile app integration. Bus stop and interchange enhancements, multimodal infrastructure, secure cycle storage at stops and e-mobility facilities, and enhanced park and ride facilities in the districts. And it also provides a consistent customer experience from the districts to the city centre. In Waimakariri, the preferred option relies on the coordination of the PT Future's bus service improvements in the districts and enhances frequency on existing direct services from Rangiora and Kaipoi, and this will be further enhanced through the MRT investments. And similarly for Selwyn District, the preferred option relies on the coordination of the PT Future's bus service improvements with new direct services from Lincoln to the city centre and enhanced frequency on the new Lincoln and other existing direct services from Rolleston, and with further enhancements, particularly in both districts through the park and ride facilities at key locations. In terms of Christchurch, the arterial street running mass rapid transit within Christchurch will provide reductions in PT travel time and higher reliability. High frequency services during peak periods with increased capacity, improved passenger experience and comfort, simplified ticketing and boarding systems, land value uplift along the routes of operation and key stations, and it is an impetus for changes to the built form along routes of operation around stations and typically more commercial space, higher demand for shopping and densification of residential development. The preferred street running corridor is approximately 22 kilometres in length and connects Hornby to Belfast via the city centre. It extends along Main South Road, Riccarton Avenue, Chilham Street, Manchester Street, Kilmore Street, Victoria Street, Papanui Road and Main North Road, and consists of 21 stop locations. In terms of the corridor environment, by reducing vehicle lane widths and removing parking in the 20-metre corridor, a dedicated two-directional MRT service can be achieved with provision for pedestrians. However, these corridors are constrained. Transit malls are being considered at key centres with MRT and active modes given priority and space for tree planting and street edge activation. In terms of land acquisition, there will be a need to purchase around stations and intersections. Changes will also be necessary to the street network with side street and other public realm upgrades possible. Consideration is also being given to targeted land acquisition to promote high quality urban outcomes along the corridor, and this is undertaken through an all-of-government approach. Key objectives or benefits for the consideration of land purchase may include improving the wider PT network connections, increasing the first and last mile accessibility, supporting highly accessible Kāinga Ora communities, increasing urban forest canopy cover, and achieving wider urban amenity goals to support place function, quality public realm, and intensification around stations and key nodes, much of which George pointed to in his presentation as well. So this is just echoing a lot of what's happening on a world stage. In terms of the costs and estimates, got up there, the estimated cost is between 3 to 4 billion, depending on the mode. The business case work has been mode agnostic to date, so looking at both light rail and rapid bus networks, bus metro. So the light rail is around about 2.9 to 3.8 billion and has a capacity to carry 210 to 300 people per vehicle and runs on steel tracks with a benefit cost ratio of 1.2. And the bus metro is estimated to cost between 2.2 and 2.8 billion with a capacity of about 150 to 180 people per vehicle, but avoids the needs for tracks, which is part of the reduction in the overall cost, with a BCR of 1.4. So both in the positive cost benefit ratio, which is not often seen with a lot of public transport projects. Plus increased overall operational costs for our public transport system with MRT being introduced. However, there will be some reduction as MRT does replace some of the existing bus services on our core routes. Yep. And just lastly, the proposed phasing. So there's a staged introduction of rapid transits proposed. This would optimise value for money and the timely provision of additional services. The early introduction would be from the city to Church Corner and Papanui with interchange facilities at both. Improved bus services from Church Corner and Papanui to Rolleston, Templeton, Lincoln and Belfast, Kaipoi, Rangiora. Extensions depend on depot locations and bus turnaround facilities and would limit the wider impacts to the freight and state highway network. The next phase is the detailed business case, which builds on the indicative business case that we've done to date and will ensure the project is viable and will meet the agreed objectives. And the timeline, the indicative timeline for that, we're looking to scope and procure, and within a 12 to 18 month period, that work would be completed. The DBC is anticipated to have a 24 to 36 month program for design, consultation and planning, and then MRT would be implemented over 5 to 10 years. And my last slide, just jump back. So also the consideration of the future of rail. Now, I know this has been a topic in the media of late, and it's something we do need to have a conversation about. So how does this connect with the mass rapid transit in Greater Christchurch? I'll leave these questions with you. It will require significant investment, and particularly to double track our rail network and decarbonise. We also have to do future regional spatial planning for Canterbury and across the South Island and New Zealand, and look at how our population growth and change will occur across the region. We also need to consider our climate change impacts, constraints and critical infrastructure, and how this competes with freight movement across the South Island as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and happy to take any questions as part of the panel. Thank you.
Kia ora, my name is Rosee Hodgson, so I'm a lowly student at the University of Otago, and I think my role here tonight is just to take us back to some of that future thinking that was started at the beginning of this. And my research is part of a bigger project of research called Healthy Future Mobility Solutions, and this was done with a number of universities and groups across New Zealand. And my focus within this research was looking at young people, so it was really cool to hear earlier from Natalie about her experiences here in Christchurch. But there's a question of, why would I even do this research? Why would I focus particularly on young people here in Christchurch and in Auckland? And I think we have to think about transport in its context of, what are we talking about when we're talking about using transport across the city? And it comes back a lot of the time in these conversations to access. But I'm going to try to explore with you why public transport might be important, with particular reference to a group here in Christchurch and that I worked with in Auckland, and why it needs to be considered from an equity perspective. So access is to things, their amenities, to healthcare, to whānau and family, to friends, and to things like education and jobs. You need to get there. Access is about spatially dispersed locations across the city, and you'd like to get there. So if we look at education and jobs, this was really one of the sources of where I began with my research. So this is a Christchurch map, and it's looking at young people here in Christchurch who are not in education, employment or training. Neat. Now, I'm not going to use that word from here on in. It'll be some really long sentence along the lines of excluded from education, employment or training. And the reason being, I don't like to frame them in this light. But we did use this map that was created by a friend to consider, along with stakeholders, where might be some areas where there are young people who are struggling to be in education or work or training, and let's go and talk to them why this could be the case. So we settled on Aranui and Hornby, which we had a nice descriptive of being this very car-dominated place. So in addition to having a high proportion of these young people, there's also this difference in geography in these two locations that made them interesting to compare. The way we did this, I think, is quite important too, because I guess the whole reason I'm here tonight is that often these young people aren't at the table, right? Their voices aren't heard. So if there's one reason I accepted to come and freak myself out for the evening, It's because I want their voices to be on the table as we discuss these issues here in Christchurch. So we did this in 3 ways. Excuse the Auckland map. We did the same thing here. And then we collected data in 3 ways. First of all, the whole premise of this was that I went into communities, found young people who were keen to be a part of the research, trained them as researchers, and worked with them. So that was an amazing part of the project, and a couple of them are watching tonight, and they scare me a whole lot more than any of you guys, because they're the ones checking up on what I'm saying. So they collected data in 3 ways. They did interviews with their peers. So the young people who were doing the interviews also weren't in work. We employed them for the period of time of the research, and they had experienced many of the same things. They also conducted participatory mapping. They sat with them, they guided young people to mark out their experiences across space, including how they got to places and what were their perceptions of using those transport modes. And a third aspect was taking photographs and uploading it to a Facebook page that I ran to kind of give them a third way to express some of these experiences. This is big and complicated, and I still struggle to explain it all. But really it came down to 4 aspects of what came through in their interviews. First off was that they believed that trying to get to work in the current transport system was a cycle that didn't help itself. So there's a lot that came out about how difficult it can be to reach these places of education, employment, and training. Second, and a little bit disturbing, was the level at which they felt that racism and stigma defined how they use transport in their own cities. Third, the social context, both who they were trying to move around and who they wanted to be with, but also who are they in the context of their own society. And the fourth was the significance of mobility for youth wellbeing. And that's where I'd really like to start, to hear this young lady's voice. This is a young lady in Hornby. And she really is the place I go back to understand how it is I break down what I learnt from this whole project. I'd like to take you on a little bit of a journey of how I got from access to something a bit more than access in the process of working with these young people. So access is also associated with social exclusion, right? You can't get to work, you can't work. If you can't get to healthcare, probably poor health outcomes. For this young lady, I'm just going to read it. I want to do things. I feel like staying in one place is really bad for depression. I want to do things, and the doctor said I should be doing things, but I can't do things because I don't have money, and I don't have a job, and all this shit. Now, if we break it down a little bit, this young lady didn't have a license, didn't have a car, and a lot of her discussion that came through in this interview was actually about the fact that it was her fault that her mental health was deteriorating, because she couldn't bring herself to take a licensing test. She then couldn't get a license, get a car, and get out and fix what she thought was her problem. And I think it's really important because it points out, what do cars have to do with this? And yes, this is public transport, and I'll get there. But it does, it comes back. I think it's been reflected in all the talks so far, that underpinning all of this is an assumption around young people's use of cars, and that they want to, that they need to, and that's what we're providing. So this young guy in Aranui, he said, it's like, you can't really get loans or anything without being able to pay it back, but you can't get a job without a car, so it's a cycle that doesn't really work. He's the guy I kind of used as that starter. And in this case, he actually showed up to an interview, and they'd accepted him for this interview. When he got there, they said, do you have a car? And he said no, and they said, well, sorry, you can't have the job. And that's the context. And he said, why did you invite me? I got here using other means of getting here, and yet I get here, and if you ask me if I have a car and I can't have it. And I really wanted to point this out, that this is actually a part of that wider conversation we need to be having around the expectations of what transport and daily mobility look like, because it has true implications for young people here in Christchurch. So how were these young people conducting their daily mobility? Let's get into that a little bit. First, the way they had to handle aspects of this, because it became clear in many of the interviews, these young people had sporadic use of cars. If a mate happened to lend them one, if mum and dad could drop them off, often, we even had stories of young people who lent a car to a mate and it didn't come back, and so they lost their job because they couldn't get there anymore. But actually, there was this amazing ability to adjust to however they needed to get places. They balanced local living with wider trips. They adore where they're from. Hornby might be ugly from a bird's-eye view, but living there, these young people are all about it. Same with Aranui. Someone's zooming me. They're also multimodal. So this is something that we talk about a lot in transport policy, this idea that we want people on buses, we want them cycling, we want them walking, and then, cars are kind of the dirty word. These young people are living out these kinds of daily mobility. They're the ones doing it because they have to. But they also face barriers that include racism, stigma, loss of comfort and familiarity, negative social interactions as they move around, the cost of getting around, the expectations of employers, poor mental health, and the social expectations that define the good citizen. And I actually looked at this across space. So we looked at the way they use transport across space. But with the way that these young people were describing their experiences, I really wanted to see, well, how do you spatially experience aspects of what you're describing, like racism? How do you perceive social interaction across space? The yellow one is comfort and belonging. That's a bit hard to see. And cost. And really, what we found from working with these young people was that it was not only about getting from A to B and whether there was a bus, while that was important, and the cost of it. It was also around this invisible landscape in which they were moving, where they felt they did and didn't belong. And it often had to do with the fact that they were somehow moving in a way that was seen as lesser, as less of a citizen. Here they are, young people who are excluded from education, employment, or training, and they feel as though they sit on the margins of their society. Their movement is marginal. Their position in society is marginal, and they begin to perceive the city in this way. So when I handed them this map, we printed them out for them to annotate. If you remember back, they annotated them, they stuck stickers on them. I didn't expect to be handed back an image of how they experience the city as friction in which they had to pass through. And all of this sounds like there's no end to it. But then there was this hopeful experience that the young people would talk about how they used public transport for other things. One young man in Aranui said, "It's important just to explore. Like if you're trying to find a job, you're expanding where you want to get a job." Another said, "We just generally go for a cruise on public transportation and see where it takes us. We'll hop off at some random stop and just go for a walk around." And it led me to consider public transport as this tool for leveling the playing field. All of a sudden, they're talking about public transport as the type of freedom we associate with cars. Why? Because they build ownership of their city spaces, and when they're invited onto public transport and they are seen as part of the welcome public, it is a tool for creating citizens who are welcome across the city. And I think that was the thing that I wanted to land on tonight, was that just as we can look around and say there are places overseas doing this, we can actually also look at public transport as a real power for good, because it levels the playing field, especially if it's done in particularly just ways. So there's 3 opportunities, I think, here. These young people are already the innovators in daily mobility for our future. You want decarbonisation, they're not the people creating the carbon. Second, supporting multimodality. We need to put our money where our mouths are around multimodality. These young people are doing it. Go and ask them how are they doing it and support it. Third, enhancing citizenship. And honestly, this is the one that gets me. Why is it disappearing? Public transport systems have the power to shape citizenship and belonging in positive ways. So if we go back to that map of Christchurch, slowly. It is an opportunity to signal to these young people and many others that this city is theirs as well. And the outcome of that is unknown here in Christchurch. How could that impact how they perceive themselves in relation to the wider city? And I think that's an incredible opportunity as we think ahead to how we're doing public transport here in Christchurch. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Can we just thank all of our panelists once more for all of their great presentations? So, I guess what came out for me and what I was sort of really interested of was there were lots of different sort of visions for the future. So, sort of what it could look like, learning from other cities, sort of building off of what is already happening here or what people are already doing. For you three, what do you sort of see how we get to this future? What do you sort of see as the things that need to happen to get to the points that you were talking about in your presentations? George, you'll start with you. I think your mic's on.
Mic's on. Fantastic. Okay, I'll keep this quick. We've got lots of questions to get through. The basic point I want to think about is the last slide I showed about don't just fixate on, oh, we can't do it. No. That's rubbish. It's really boring. Focus on actually what you can, focus on what you want to achieve, and then work out how to make it happen in that order, please.
For me, bold decision making, investment in our future and our future generations is two of the most critical things. I think we need political will to do what we want, political will to get us there, but bold decision making and investment is going to be our near-term future.
I think, excuse me, there's a concept of just transitions. So whatever decisions we're making, I think need to be made considering how they affect groups like the ones that I worked with. And I think, yeah, there's a lot in that. There's a lot of examples of how people are doing that in decarbonising. So that would be the short answer.
Yeah, well, I guess because the thing that sort of jumped out to me was there's so many pieces of this puzzle, especially while through sort of Jesse's presentation, there's so many different agencies, there's so many different communities and people that are sort of coming through, or I guess models that we could base ourselves off of. I guess did you want to sort of talk about that, of how do we sort of create a vision sort of from all of these different puzzle pieces, if anyone has a sort of...
Copy what's happened before. I think that's really the point that I was trying to make in my talk. If you're wondering about how to collect rubbish in a street that's been turned into a pedestrian wall with tramways, there'll be 50 other cities around the world that have figured out how to do it. Don't just say we can't pedestrianise the street because the rubbish truck can't get down there. Do you think that they don't collect rubbish in Milan? Come on. Yeah, well, yeah, plagiarise, but call it research.
Yeah, look, I think we've been building, Greater Christchurch has been working in this space since 2007, as I said, with the urban development strategy, and we're just building on different layers. We've had some massive challenges in Greater Christchurch. I've been here since 2008, pre-earthquake. It's an exciting place to live, and I think we're just putting the building blocks in place now for a really positive future going forward. And personally invested in our future here with my own kids and my future here, and that's what we come to work every day to look forward to. So yeah, I think we're just building a picture here and we're moving forward, and things like mass rapid transit I think are just us stepping into the 21st century.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one when you look to examples, because I'd say that when it comes to equity, we often don't have great examples of public transport, in the sense that I'd compare public transport to the similar ways we address like placemaking, right? That if you are considering places as made for people of many different needs, you're going to be including those voices, you're going to have different ways that you require design, right? We don't tend to think about that from the perspective of access for people who might be marginalised in other ways. So I think it's a complex one that, yes, we absolutely need to look at examples, but we also need to be thinking about how we build in a welcoming environment, not just a fast one. And I think that's really hard. It's moving pieces, right? But it's actually some of the same sorts of things that we talk about with placemaking.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass to Jess now to have a question from the audience.
Ben, great, thank you. We've had two people ask the same question. Expanding and improving public transport, even just bus lanes, is something business owners on our main corridors have fought bitterly and repeatedly against in the past. Plans for getting them on board, explaining the benefits they gain, and breaking their tired focus on losing car parks? Ideas?
Oh, I think that one might be for me. Yeah, look, that is a challenge, I think, in terms of providing the public transport corridors, particularly bus lanes down some of our more busy streets, particularly our arterial routes like Riccarton Road and Papanui Road. Privatisation of the public realm is on-street parking, essentially. To be able to remove parking enables more people to use our public transport services in a far more efficient way. Personally, I catch the bus up and down Riccarton Road every day, and it frustrates me every time I get on the bus and there's a car parked in the bus lane where there's directly under a sign that says "Do not park here" during peak periods. That parking's not there. That restriction's not there all day. That's the peak periods when we're trying to move the large volumes of people up and down those busways. So look, yeah, there is parking generally available on a lot of sites privately. So that public realm parking is not necessarily for private use. So.
Thanks. Another person said, George, how have other cities overcome that kind of objection from businesses?
I think the main thing is to work with businesses successfully. And I mean, you can't please all the people all of the time. And I mean, there's always 5% of the population that hates you no matter what. Don't worry about them. They'll always be angry. They love being angry. But focus on what businesses like. And businesses, I mean, if you're running a business, you've got a million things to worry about: paying your suppliers, customers, taxes, employees, off sick, whatever. You don't want to be worrying about, oh, by the way, there's 10 months of disruption outside your road while they dig it up for some reason. You hate it. So in Auckland, we had a really good example with High Street, where there was a proposal to turn High Street into a shared space, which would be really awesome, but it would have taken a year's worth of disruption and one of the best streets for independent businesses. Instead, it was done using temporary interventions in 3 days, replacing car parking with boardwalks to widen the footways. It's been a tremendous success. It was done overnight, no disruption to business. Businesses loved it. It's been a real success. And I mean, the Bordeaux example I mentioned earlier, that was done from a business perspective. It wasn't done because the mayor was a zealot who'd been to the tram show and wanted some for himself. It was because he wanted Bordeaux to be prosperous and have a really strong economy. So he worked with the business, the Chambord, the Commerce de Bordeaux, or whoever they are, to actually work out what they required in terms of how do you make it happen, what can we do to minimise disruption, work out a compensation package. And just the final point before I shut up is this wasn't just about public transport being efficient. The streets were made beautiful so that every time you get off the bus or off the tram in Bordeaux, there's beautiful paving, the streets are wide, it welcomes you in, you just go into town for the joy of being in town. And I think we must not forget the human element, of picking up on Rosee's point, that it's not just about people per hour, it's do people want to be there or not? Is it a joy to be there? And if you can demonstrate that it is a joy to be in the urban environment and you can make it happen, and that you are listening, then I think you've got a much, much better chance of success.
A completely different question. Public transport is not catered to people who are neurodiverse. Best ideas to make transport easier for neurodiverse people?
I can say something to this first. Is mainly, I think, sort of just building off of some of those things that Rosee talked about, which was sort of listening to some of these communities' problems and sort of listening to some of the barriers that these people are facing from a wide range of communities. There's lots of things that you sort of see in the media about sort of people who are in wheelchairs or sort of young families, people with prams and those sort of things and the challenges that they face. And a lot of these will be changes that can just be made through the sort of transport providers, sort of technical changes or sort of adjustments to the buses or whatever transport system we're using. but oftentimes just starting at a point of listening and learning from some of these communities can be just the best place to start from.
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo everything that Em's just said. Yeah, totally agree.
Me too.
There's a few questions asking about the cultural shift that Natalie talked about. You know, this isn't just about painting a nice picture, it's about changing hearts and minds, ideas.
I'll start, but I'll defer to my fellow speakers who actually live in Christchurch. And I think just as water flows downhill, people do what's easiest. And I'd like to sort of put a swear jar for any time anyone talks about encouraging public transport, you put $10 in, and that will pay for something quite cool. Because you don't want to encourage it. You can encourage anything, but people can just say no. You need to enable public transport. You need to make it desirable and more convenient than any other way of getting around. So think about that. Levels of service. Frequency is freedom. Is the quality of interchange good? Is the pedestrian realm good? People will do what's easiest. It's basically that. I mean, I knew somebody who had never really cycled for transport, but then studied for a year in Amsterdam, had bought a bicycle within about 5 minutes, because that's the easiest thing to do. People do what's easiest. So really think about that from a customer's perspective.
Yeah, look, I think supporting people to change their behaviour, I think we're going through a space now looking at how we get people to travel less by private car, but we can't get them out of their car if there isn't the enabled public transport and active modes that they can turn to. So behaviour change is a huge challenge right across the country to get people to change the way they travel, take the time that they need to travel as well. We're slowly building our network up to be able to support people to travel by public transport, but it does require everybody to undertake that challenge themselves. It's a big shift in the way we move away from a car-dominated, car-centric Greater Christchurch that we've been used to.
I think too, if you want to think about really building public transport in a way that shifts culture, so many of these things that, well, I'll stick to my research, that are attached to wider expectations on what people are able to achieve, you know, and it's a really difficult thing when basically our culture says bigger, better, faster, stronger, and, you know, and if you can get to work quickly and that kind of thing. And so there's probably some worth in, I think, you know, it's already happening in some sectors, and I can see people here ready to talk to this way better than me, but other people in the room. But this aspect where, you know, businesses have a role in allowing that innovation to be occurring within that area as well. So young people who are being told you can't have a job here unless you have a car and you can prove to me, or you have a license at least and can prove to me that you can pass through this one aspect of what we consider growing up in New Zealand. And I think it's a big challenge to consider how do we support private sector to be shifting their cultures as well. Because in the end, if we're expecting it to be on individuals, we're continuing a cycle of it's kind of your fault, so pick it up and make it work for yourself. Whereas I think there's some real potential with going to businesses and stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. Hearts and minds.
Mm.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm just going to sort of leave us on this final question, which is, what do you, from your perspectives, I think we started to touch on some of these things, but from your perspectives, what will encourage more people to dream about a city with a brilliant public transport system? How do we sort of move from just the group of people in this room or sort of the people who are paid to work in these spaces to sort of encouraging more people to dream about a city with a fantastic public transport system that we want to see?
Well, the thing is, not everyone is a dreamer. Some people can envisage anything. Some people just really do not have that ability, and that's fine. You don't have to create glorious visual fantasies for 100% of the population. But for those who do dare to dream, well, do come to Auckland when City Rail Link's open. It'll be fantastic. But there's no substitute for experience. Go to other places and see. Go to Nelson and go cycling. Go to Wellington and catch the train. Just, experience what life can be. And also, I think there are changes that Waka Kotai has brought through, making it easier to close streets temporarily for events and such like. There is no substitute for experiencing a street for a weekend without cars to think, hang on a sec, life could be different. So if your local board wants to do that, go and help them. Go and dig in. Anything that you can do to change streets locally, temporarily, will shift the Overton window.
Yeah, absolutely support all of that as well. And I think, look, youth, we had a lot of youth engagement through the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan and the MRT work. Youth have a lot to offer in terms of our future, and we're building our future for our young people. And I sit around the dinner table at home with my kids and we talk about these things, and I think it's just getting that conversation going so that they start talking to their friends about it, and then we start to build a different attitude towards public transport and active modes. That's who we're building this future for. Some of us will be here for the next 20, 30 years. We've got an ageing population that won't be with us for forever, but our youth are going to have experienced this for the next 50, 60, 70 years. So that's what I'm looking forward to most.
Yeah, just thinking, it was really interesting when working with young people that I did, that there was a strong desire to be living in a way that was local, that was active, but it was confronted with the difficulties of how they were actually living and the day-to-day struggles that they were having. And I think one of the things that really stuck with me was this hope. That was an aspect of how they spoke, that they said that when asked about the future of transport in their cities, they said, someone is going to make it better. And there was this sort of collective idea that there are these really smart people, and that we think that they're going to crack it. And it was this incredible thing for me to take away and say that that's what you can get excited for when it comes to designing transport. I did not come to a transport PhD, honestly. When my family found out I was doing one, they thought I was counting buses. And honestly, that didn't get me excited. But when you hear that these young people really are excited about a future in our hands, that's a lot of trust. And it gets me excited to think that that's kind of what we're working for. So I think that works for other people as well.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. If we could all just give them all a round of applause. And now, just to close us out for the evening, I'm going to invite Claudia Jardine. Claudia is the author of the hot and slippery poetry collection Biter, which is available for purchase at the back of the room. She has an MA in Classics with distinction from Te Heiranga Waka Victoria University of Wellington, where she won the 2020 Alex Scobie Research Prize and a Marsden Grant for Master of Scholarship. She will also be performing on the 10th of October at the Tees Museum in the Arts Centre, and she's also currently fundraising for the Australian National Young Writers Festival in Australia. Claudia.
Thanks, Em. Kia ora. I'm here to read two poems. Somehow, a lot of my poetry slam career has been about dunking on cars. When I was a teenager, I did a slam poem about Subarus and the types of behaviour that drivers of Subarus tended to exhibit. And then as a 20-something in Ōtautahi, it became this other type of car, which has been mentioned this evening. So this poem is called My Attempt to Remain in a State of Questioning. Why do you drive a double cab ute? Do you dislike small things? Do the minutiae of life threaten you? Do you have lots of things you need to carry from one place to another? Are your arms sore? Is your back sore? Have you a loved one who lives in isolation up a steep, rough road far from the public, and do you need to provide them with printouts of visual jokes from the internet daily to appease their questionable sense of humour? Are you scared that if you failed to complete your daily delivery, they would disinherit you, and you would never again see the walnut tree of your childhood? Does narrowly avoiding side-swiping cyclists turn you on? Do you need to feel turned on to tolerate the reality of your daily commute? Are you secretly 8 people in a trench coat? Are you secretly 8 people in a trench coat and you are all spies who need to avoid detection except for when you can get into your double cab ute and successfully pass for 2 barbershop quartets? Are you living in your double cab ute? Are you living in your double cab ute with your barbershop quartet and your rival barbershop quartet? Are you a weekend warrior? Are you the weekend warrior chieftain who has received explicit permission from the Department of Weekend Warriors to drive your double cab ute to a licensed 4-wheel drive track with 4 other weekend warriors? Have you heard the odds for collisions involving double cab utes? Does a narrow tire make you think of a guillotine? Do you know how much you frighten me? Are you smuggling many intensely bonded rabbits of the Flemish giant variety to a new life in your well-fenced rabbit sanctuary? Are your children incredibly swollen? Do you fill the tray of your double cab ute with jelly and drive to team building events so Kathy and Richard can process their not dissimilar trauma via vague and clumsy body binds in pursuit of tickets for a meat raffle? Do you tip the jelly off the wharf afterward to the delight and then bewilderment of seagulls? Are you on your way to an award ceremony known for awarding giant certificates to match their giant novelty checks? Are you pretty sure you're going to win? Are you confident? Are they going to call your name any minute now? Are you attempting to beam humbly? Are you about to be? Oh my gosh. Oh yes, yes you are. Are you aware that you need to ask yourself if you really, honestly, unselfishly need to drive a double cab ute? Thank you. My friend Lily Wenmouth illustrated that poem, and we made a little zine which I'm selling up the back for koha if you would like to take one home and perhaps slip it in the pocket of your nearest and potentially dearest who might drive a very large vehicle. In a slightly different tone, I'm going to read you a poem from Baita called Some Auxiliary Findings of Falling in Love with a Member of the Green Party. My feelings for you are like double cab utes in an urban environment. Once I recognized their size and their inconvenience to all other road users, they were everywhere. The way I feel about you is the afternoon with a temperature of 27 degrees in late May. Something scientists and our mutual friend who has a diploma in environmental management predicted years ago. My feelings for you are like discovering in the time it takes to charge the battery of a Nissan Leaf to 7%, you can get to second base on its back seat. This way I feel about you is nothing like the percentage of utes observed in an Auckland University city traffic survey that were actually using their tray to carry something. 9%. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Claudia. So a huge thank you to all our speakers, to everyone for a very stimulating conversation, which got us more charged up about the future of public transport here in Ōtautahi and Greater Christchurch. Thanks to the supporters of He Whakawhiti Kōrero Christchurch Conversations, Christchurch City Council, and He Puna Ora Regenerative Action Labour AUT. Remember, you can find the recording of tonight's event on the Te Pūtahi YouTube channel if you'd like to share it with others. Please save the date for our next conversation on the 17th of October called Reaching a Happy Medium in Urban Housing. It'll be held here in Tūranga at 6 p.m. Come and hear from leading experts in medium and higher density housing. A little bit nervous about that one. You can book for this now, see our website for details. So, the past was about building elaborate networks of car infrastructure. The future is about a multimodal, accessible, low-carbon transportation system. I think to achieve this locally, we need to be a more connected and organised community that meaningfully supports and advocates for public transport in Ōtautahi and Greater Christchurch. We already have the most effective groups for active transport, especially cycling, possibly also walking thanks to living streets, but that could use some support too. But where are the groups and residents advocating for public transport here? And not just intercity rail, but local groups advocating for rapid bus, for more space and greater budgets for public transport. So our question to you all tonight is, what are you doing to contribute to this future? And what are we collectively doing to contribute to this future? If we want a better city, a better future for us and our children after us, we need to be an active part of making it happen. Pō Mārie.